Okay, so this is a really hard question today. It's going to be a really difficult one we're going to look at, which is evaluate the view that the UK has regained sovereignty since it left the EU. Really tricky question. I think most students would probably stay away from this if they got it. But I think for that reason, it kind of gives you a lot of potential though to go for this question and make a lot of marks really easily. Okay, so I think the first point to make here is if we're going to get a return of sovereignty, what we want is we want Britain to be able to remove, repeal all existing or old EU law that it had been subjected to. So when Britain left the EU in January 2020, all existing EU laws were retained, and that was done because it would have been too complicated just to get rid of all laws and regulations on one single day. It would have been too difficult to do, so they wanted to do it kind of over time. Now, one of the first points I'd like to make here is that given that 25% of UK law was derived from the EU, so it had been law that had been made in the EU, that suggests that actually, hang on, quite a whole chunk of the UK's laws were actually from the EU. And really, does that suggest a return of sovereignty? I would probably say in this instance, no. However, remember what I said earlier, which is that the UK was kind of planning to do it over time. So what we want to know is, has it achieved that goal? And to some extent, it kind of has. So one of the things it can do is it has been able to make amendments to the law to address these kind of what they're going to call technical deficiencies within these laws. So they're able to make minor changes after January 2020. And what we saw was around about 100,000 amendments made. So that does show you that actually, hang on, there has been a return of sovereignty, and the UK Parliament is now in a position where it can make amendments to laws, whereas obviously previously it would not have been able to do that. Now, an example of this would be the UK Parliament's ability to get rid of laws and former EU agencies and replace them with new ones. So a great example here is that the UK Parliament passed the Agricultural Act in 2020, and that replaced what had been the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. So here what we've got is complete return of sovereignty, because previously Britain has been subject to the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, which it didn't really agree with in many respects, and they've been able to replace something that they felt was much more better for UK-based farmers. Okay, so on the flip of that, I think what we want to think about here then is, yes, they've been able to, the UK government's been able to make changes to, these technical deficiencies within laws, slight amendments here and there, but have they been able to get rid of EU law that we were still subject to? Well, actually, the answer really is no. Now, in this instance, we think that from July 2023, the UK government said that there was around 200 pieces of EU law, around about 2,000 EU regulations that was still being retained in the UK. Now, what that means is that only about 1 in 5 of the EU retained laws has been repealed, replaced, or amended. That is quite a small number. So only 1 in 5 have actually been got rid of. So we want to take that into account here, and we would have to say that really Britain hasn't actually taken the opportunity to regain that sovereignty and to repeal EU law or to replace it with its own laws. Right, but I think the important point here to make if we're doing the evaluation, so we've taken the two arguments that Britain has not actually removed many of the EU laws, but we've then said, like, kind of on the flip of that, that they can make these technical deficiency changes. But what we want to do is in the evaluation, I think the important point is that on balance, I would actually say that sovereignty has been returned in this instance. The fact is that the UK government can now repeal the laws if it wishes, but it's actually chosen not to do so. And that's the important thing, is that they've kind of gone, well, actually, a lot of these EU laws are fine, that they work for us. We want to keep them. Had we not been a member of the EU, we may have put them in place anyway. But the fact is they've now got the ability to keep, to amend, or to repeal any legislation if they wish. And that was a power that they did not previously have. Now, we're looking for an example here. We always want to get some good evidence in there to really kind of give some extra weight to our opinions. So what I'd say here is that in 2023 or by 2023, we believe that the UK has repealed around about 587 EU-derived legislative instruments. So that is quite a big deal. And what we can expect, obviously, is that over time, the UK governments will take more opportunity and more chances to repeal legislation. So the second point I want to make, though, is about Northern Ireland. A bit complicated, so bear with us, but we're going to explain here, and I think this is a real crucial point with Northern Ireland. So first off is this: I would suggest that sovereignty has not been returned because of the difficulties of Northern Ireland. So when the UK left the EU, a deal was required that would allow trade to continue between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So the Republic of Ireland was still a member of the EU. Northern Ireland, obviously as part of the UK, was leaving the EU, but the problem became that they were worried about introducing cameras and checkpoints on borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because that might lead to violence and instability. So the solution at the time was that the Northern Ireland would remain part of the UK, but it would still be subject to the regulations and the customs checks in the EU. So goods coming into Northern Ireland from England would now be subject to customs checks. What that meant is that, in effect, the UK government would be creating a border between the UK mainland and Northern Ireland. So here's that key point to make here, which is this: Northern Ireland is still subject to EU regulations. I would argue, therefore, that if one part of the UK, one of the four nations of the UK, is still subject to EU regulations and laws, how can it be true to say that the UK has regained its sovereignty? I just don't think it can. Okay, so the term we're going to use here is however, because we're going to flip the argument around and we're going to say, yeah, it's awful. Northern Ireland is still essentially subject to EU regulations and laws. But, so we're going to, however, key point we're going to add in here is this, which is that in 2023, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, when he was the Prime Minister, agreed to the Windsor Framework with the EU. Now, that framework reduced the need for checks on goods between the UK and Northern Ireland. It also determined that the ban that had been in place on certain products like chilled sausages entering Northern Ireland from the UK was removed. Moreover, Northern Ireland, which had been subject to following EU rules on things like alcohol duties and VAT, that was removed. So that was a really important change there that went through. And now, we're seeing this kind of return of sovereignty because the UK can now change alcohol duties and VAT rates in Northern Ireland. Moreover, the Windsor Framework also introduced a mechanism called the Stormont Break, which would let the Northern Ireland Assembly object to any new EU rules that would affect Northern Ireland's trading arrangement. So, therefore, what I would say is that, yes, Northern Ireland is still subject to many EU regulations, but these have been reduced. And as such, there has been a return of sovereignty, albeit not full sovereignty, in a somewhat limited form, is what I would say. Okay, so we've got the two arguments now. What I want to do is balance them up. So which of those two is the strongest argument? I think here in the case of Northern Ireland, it would be fair to say that sovereignty has not been returned. I can't see how we're in a situation where we can claim sovereignty has been returned if that sovereignty and the UK government does not have full power, control and sovereignty over all parts of the country, particularly somewhere which is as combustible and often volatile as Northern Ireland is. Now, a good piece of evidence to back that claim up is that as of January 2024, we believe that 308 EU laws and regulations still apply in Northern Ireland. I think, therefore, in this case, there is not a return of sovereignty. There is a very diminished, very a kind of minor form of sovereignty that's been retained by the UK government in this instance. Okay, so the final point to make here is going to be about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was signed between the EU and the UK in December 2020. What that agreement said was that there would be no tariffs on goods traded between the EU and the UK, and importantly, that the UK would no longer have to abide by EU regulations. So in this sense, there has been an absolute full return of sovereignty because the UK doesn't have to abide by these EU regulations any longer. Now, moreover, a really good example of this is that previously EU fishermen had full access to UK waters. That now has been reduced, and EU fishermen are no longer allowed to catch as much fish in UK waters as they previously had done. And in fact, the UK is going to regain 25% of what the EU fishermen are currently catching in British waters within 5 years. So here, what we're getting is a full return of sovereignty. The Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, called this a cakeist treaty. So he said the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was a cakeist treaty. And what he meant by that was that the UK was having its cake and eating it, i.e. it was getting all of the best bits of leaving the EU with none of the bad bits at all. So obviously you're going to have to say however in a second, because obviously it was Boris Johnson. He probably wasn't telling the full story. Okay, so what were the negatives of this trade and cooperation agreement? Well, as we said in the previous slide, yes, the UK no longer is subject to EU regulations. However, because goods moving between the UK and the EU are now subject to checks at the border, many companies have decided that they don't wish to diverge from EU standards. And that's because it would cost them so much more money to go through the checks needed at the border. So many UK companies have gone, yeah, well, we're still going to abide by EU regulations because actually not to do so would cost us a lot of money. Right. Moreover, and these are two really important points here, part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement said that there had to be a level playing field and a non-regression rule between the UK and the EU. So what did that mean? First off, the level playing field clause said that the UK couldn't do things that member states of the EU couldn't do. So it couldn't, for example, offer subsidies to businesses. And that was one point of, that was a very big selling point of Brexit at one point. The second part is this non-regression clause. So this non-regression clause said that EU said, well, UK, you can't cut, workers' rights, or you can't cut environmental protection rules. Now, the UK might want to do that because if the UK could, for example, force its workers to work longer, if they could get rid of environmental protection regulations, then companies could do things way cheaper than countries in the EU could do that. The EU didn't want that competition. Of course they wouldn't. So they put these two clauses in there. But in essence, this is problematic for the UK because yes, Britain's had this return of sovereignty, but it can't exercise it. It is actually still stuck abiding by EU regulations. It can't do all the things that it said it was going to do. And when it left the EU, it can't offer subsidies to businesses. It can't get rid of EU environmental protection laws. It can't reduce workers' rights in the manner that it said it was. So in fact, in many regards, Britain's in the worst of both worlds because now it's got this return of sovereignty, but it can't actually exercise it. So quite simply here, on balance, I would argue that sovereignty has not been returned. The UK government has got the ability to exercise power now, but it can't. It simply can't. It's still bound by so many of the EU regulations because of the things like the level playing field and the non-regression clauses. So, for example, and it's a good example to chuck in here is, the UK might want to repeal the Working Hours Directive, which limits the number of hours that European workers can work each week, but it can't. So they might want to get rid of that and say, well, no, hang on, UK workers, you could be forced to work more than 48 hours a week, but it can't get rid of that. It's stuck by that, and it can't offer subsidies to businesses. Another thing that they wanted to do to try and promote UK businesses or to help UK businesses in a competitive international market, it can't do that. So I would argue here that the UK really has got the worst of both worlds now. It has had this return of sovereignty, but it can't use it. That's pretty problematic, I would argue. And therefore, on balance, I'd say that sovereignty has not been returned. It is just an illusion. Okay, so what I do want to do is just give kind of a bit of balance, because we've been quite negative in terms of where sovereignty has not been returned. So let's just look at how there has been some aspects where full sovereignty has been returned to UK since Brexit. So the first point I'd make is that the UK no longer has to contribute to the EU budget. You know, the UK had been the second largest net contributor to the EU, sending, kind of somewhere about like £9 billion a year. Britain doesn't have to do that any longer. And the important point is that this is a return of sovereignty, because whereas previously they were sending £9 billion to the EU was determining how that money was spent. Now that money remains within the UK, and the UK government determines how it is spent. The second point to make is about borders. And obviously previously, as a member of the EU, Britain had to abide by the free movement of people. So all EU citizens had the right to come and live and work in the United Kingdom. The UK government now has control again over its borders and determining who is allowed in and who is not allowed into the UK. So in both these cases, I would argue that the UK government has seen a return of sovereignty. Now, you could easily argue, in both these incidences, you could say, well, hang on, but immigration's increased. What I would say is that, yes, that these things are true, but they are not issues of sovereignty. So when we're talking and we're answering that first question, which is about return of sovereignty, the key is that the British government now can determine who comes into the UK and who does not come in. And, that's a big change from what was previously the case. So we are seeing here in these two cases a return of sovereignty. Right, I try my best to keep this video under about 15 minutes, just gone a little bit over that, but I hope it's been helpful. What I'm going to try and do on the website, politicsbyexample.com, is to try and look at things like the level playing field clause and the non-regression clause. I'm going to try and do some short explainer videos on those. So if you want a bit more detail, a bit more help on what those are, then please go to politicsbyexample.com.